What would you do if the enemy you'd been taught to hate for years suddenly showed you the only mercy you'd seen in months? Before we dive into one of the most powerful stories of post-war reconciliation you've never heard, let me know in the comments where you're watching from, and if you've ever experienced a moment that completely changed your perception of someone you thought you knew. This is not just another war story. This is the account of a single afternoon in September 1945 that shattered every assumption about enemies and allies, about pride and humility, about hunger and hope. What happened in a makeshift kitchen in Yokosuka port didn't just feed bodies. It fed something far more starved, the human need to be seen, to be valued, to be forgiven. And it all began with tears over a sack of salt. The war had ended 3 weeks earlier. For the Japanese people of Yokosuka, the silence after the Emperor's radio broadcast was more terrifying than any air raid siren. The Allied occupation forces arrived like a dark tide, British Commonwealth troops pouring into the naval port that had once been the pride of the Imperial Japanese Navy. Everyone knew what occupations meant. Everyone had heard the stories, the propaganda, the warnings. The enemy was coming, and mercy was not part of their reputation. Matsumoto Keiko was 63 years old, and she had survived the death of her husband, the firebombing that destroyed her restaurant, and the slow starvation of the final war months. But she wasn't sure she could survive the shame of what she was about to do. The British command had requisitioned every able cook in the port district to prepare meals for both the occupation forces and the thousands of displaced Japanese civilians now dependent on Allied rations. Keiko had been personally summoned. Her reputation as one of Tokyo's finest traditional chefs had somehow survived even the ashes of her establishment. Standing in the ruins of what had once been a naval mess hall, Keiko surveyed her kingdom with the practiced eye of a master who had nothing left to master. The kitchen was a graveyard of broken equipment. No running water. No gas for the stoves. The few pots and pans that remained were dented beyond recognition. But worst of all, no ingredients. The shelves stood completely bare. Not a grain of rice, not a dash of salt, not even the oil to coat a pan. Beside her stood 4 other women, all bearing the same hollow-eyed exhaustion, the same threadbare clothing, the same terrible choice: work for the occupiers or watch your family starve. There was young Fumiko, barely 19, who hadn't spoken since learning her father died in the Philippines. There was Hana, the fishmonger's widow, whose hands still bore the scars of shrapnel from the naval bombardment. There was Chio, the baker's wife, whose son was in an Allied POW camp somewhere in Burma. And there was Sachiko, the factory worker who'd never cooked for more than her own family but volunteered anyway because her 3 children were slowly dying of malnutrition. "They want us to cook," Fumiko whispered, her voice brittle with something between laughter and hysteria. "With what? Air? With our tears?" Keiko said nothing. She walked to the window and looked out at the harbor. British ships lined the docks like a steel verdict. Soldiers moved through the streets with that particular confidence of conquerors. And somewhere in the town, the whispers had already begun. The women working in that kitchen were collaborators, traitors, selling their dignity for a handful of rice. The British lieutenant who entered the kitchen 40 minutes later embodied every prejudice that 3 years of propaganda had burned into Japanese consciousness. Lieutenant Jeffrey Winters was tall, pale, impossibly well-fed compared to the skeletal civilians around him. His uniform was crisp. His boots were polished. His expression was the practiced neutrality of a man following orders he didn't necessarily believe in. He looked at the 5 Japanese women the way one might regard unfamiliar machinery, with assessment, not recognition. "Right then," he announced in clipped English that none of them fully understood. "You're to prepare meals for 200. Breakfast at 0600, lunch at noon, dinner at 1800. British troops and civilian refugees both. Standards will be maintained. Cleanliness is non-negotiable. Questions?" Keiko stepped forward. Her English was rudimentary, learned decades ago from missionary teachers, rusty from disuse. "Ingredients," she said simply, gesturing to the empty shelves. "We have nothing." Winters blinked, as if this possibility hadn't occurred to him. "Nothing?" "Nothing," Keiko confirmed. She met his eyes directly, which caused an uncomfortable shuffle among the other women. In the old Japan, such directness from a woman to a male authority was unthinkable. But what did the old rules matter now? No salt, no oil, no rice, no vegetables, no fish, no soy sauce, no miso, nothing. For a moment something flickered across the lieutenant's face. Was it surprise? Irritation? He turned sharply on his heel. Wait here. The women stood in silence after he left. The afternoon sun slanted through the broken windows, illuminating the dust motes that danced in the wreckage. Somewhere in the distance a child was crying. Somewhere closer soldiers were laughing. He won't come back, Hana said flatly. Or if he does, it'll be with punishment for our insolence. We should have bowed lower. We should have done exactly what Matsumoto-san did. Chiyo interrupted quietly. We told the truth. If they want us to cook, they have to give us something to cook with. But 20 minutes later, when the sound of a truck engine rumbled into the courtyard, they all froze. Fumiko's hands began to shake. Sachiko moved unconsciously toward the back door. 3 years of air raids had taught them all the same lesson. When vehicles approach, you run. Keiko alone walked to the window. What she saw made her breath catch in a way that bombs never had. A British military truck had pulled up to the kitchen entrance. But instead of Lieutenant Winters alone, 6 soldiers were climbing out of the cab and the back. And they were unloading crates. Come on then, ladies, Winters called out, his voice carrying a different tone now, not harsh, but urgent. We haven't got all day, and these supplies aren't going to move themselves. The women didn't move. Couldn't move. Because what they were seeing violated every assumption they'd built over years of war. British soldiers, the enemy, the conquerors, the demons of propaganda, were carrying wooden crates into their kitchen. Bags of rice, sacks of flour, bottles of oil, containers of salt, fresh vegetables, dried fish, even sugar, even tea. And the soldiers weren't throwing them contemptuously at the women's feet. They were placing them carefully on the counter. They were stacking them neatly on the shelves. They were organizing them like this was their own kitchen, their own supplies, their own future meals. One soldier, a burly Scotsman with a red beard, caught Sachiko staring and offered her an awkward half-smile. There you are, missus. Should be enough to get you started, aye? Sachiko didn't understand the words, but she understood the gesture. And suddenly, incomprehensibly, she was crying. Then Fumiko was crying. Then Hana. Then Chiyo. Then all of them, standing in that broken kitchen, weeping as British soldiers carried in crate after crate of ingredients. Not crying from grief this time, but from something more devastating. The sudden, overwhelming shock of being treated like human beings. Keiko walked forward on unsteady legs. Her hands that had prepared $1,000 kaiseki meals for Tokyo's elite, hands that had fed her family through famine, hands that had pulled her neighbors from burning buildings, reached out and touched a sack of rice as if it might vanish. Real, solid, enough to feed 100 people for a week. She looked up at Lieutenant Winters, who was supervising the unloading with the same crisp efficiency he'd brought to his earlier inspection. Why? She asked in her halting English. Why? Give us this. Winters paused, and for the first time she saw past the uniform to the man underneath. He looked tired. He looked like he'd aged a decade in the past year. He looked at her not with the eyes of a conqueror, but with something uncomfortably close to recognition. Because, he said slowly, choosing each word carefully, you can't cook without ingredients, and we need you to cook. And he stopped, seemed to wrestle with something, then continued. And because you're people, not enemies, not anymore, just people who need to eat. The silence that followed was profound. The kind of silence that occurs when an old world dies and a new one hasn't quite been born yet. Then Sergeant James Morrison stepped forward, a younger soldier with gentle eyes and nervous hands. He was carrying a small wooden box, which he set carefully on the counter before Keiko. Ma'am, he said softly, and something in his pronunciation of that word, the respect, the genuine deference, made Keiko's throat tighten. My mum? She came from Hiroshima, to Australia, before I was born. She taught me a bit about proper Japanese cooking, and she always said that the soul of the kitchen is in the dashi. He opened the box. Inside, carefully wrapped, were kombu seaweed and dried bonito flakes, the essential ingredients for dashi, the foundational stock of Japanese cuisine. She passed 2 years ago. Morrison continued, his voice thick. But she made me promise something. She made me promise that if I ever came to Japan, I would remember that her people weren't monsters. They were just people. Like us. And that food is how you remember you're human. The young sergeant stopped, clearly fighting his own emotions. I don't know if I'm explaining this right. My Japanese isn't. I can't. But she would want you to have this. To cook properly. With respect. The way she taught me, her mother taught her. Keiko took the box with both hands, bowing deeply. Not the shallow bow of courtesy, but the full, formal bow of genuine respect. When she straightened, tears were streaming down her face. Your mother, she said. Carefully in English. She was right. Food is how we remember. And then she did something that shocked everyone, including herself. She reached out and briefly touched Morrison's hand, a gesture of connection that crossed every boundary of culture, rank, and recent history. What happened next would be whispered about in Yokosuka for generations. Keiko turned to her women. Her voice, when she spoke in Japanese, had transformed from the dead monotone of survival into something alive with purpose. We're going to cook a meal, she announced. Not just a meal, the meal. We're going to show them, show everyone, what Japanese cuisine really is. Not the propaganda, not the caricature, the truth, the art, the soul. But Matsumoto-san, Fumiko whispered, they're the enemy. Were, Keiko corrected sharply. Were the enemy. That ended 3 weeks ago. But peace? Peace hasn't begun yet. And peace. She gestured to the supplies now filling their shelves. Peace begins in the kitchen. Where we choose to cook with love instead of hate. Where we choose to nourish instead of poison. Where we choose to build instead of destroy. She looked at each woman in turn. I know what the town is saying about us. I know what they'll say tomorrow. But let them talk. We're not cooking for them. We're cooking for something bigger than this moment. We're cooking for the future. The next 3 hours were a revelation. As Keiko and her team began preparing the evening meal, something extraordinary happened. The British soldiers didn't leave. Instead, they stayed. They watched. They asked questions. They marveled at techniques that seemed like magic to their pragmatic military cooking experience. Sergeant Morrison, true to his mother's legacy, recognized movements his mother had taught him in her Australian kitchen. The way Keiko's hands moved through the dashi preparation with ritualistic precision, the specific angle at which vegetables were cut, the importance of timing and temperature that turned simple ingredients into alchemy. That's it, he exclaimed at one point. That's exactly how Mum did it. The diagonal cut on the daikon, the... He stopped, laughing self-consciously. Sorry, ma'am. Getting carried away. But Keiko smiled. Her first genuine smile in months. No, she said. Not sorry. Your mother, she taught you well. You honor her. Other soldiers began tentatively participating. Lieutenant Winters, who'd initially intended to simply supervise and leave, found himself being taught how to properly rinse rice by Sachiko, who demonstrated with the patience of someone teaching a child. A Welsh corporal helped Chio prepare vegetables, his rough hands surprisingly gentle with the delicate work. Even the tough Scottish soldier who'd been the first to unload supplies ended up in a corner learning how to properly fold and pleat dumpling wrappers from Hana, who had stopped crying and started teaching. But the true transformation occurred when the Japanese civilian refugees began to gather. Word had spread through the makeshift camps that the collaborator women were cooking in the old naval kitchen. At first, people came to judge, to witness the shame, to confirm their prejudices about those who would work for the occupiers. A small crowd gathered at the kitchen windows, their faces hard with judgment and hunger in equal measure. Then the smells began drifting out. Proper Japanese cooking. Not the thin gruel of wartime rations. Not the desperation meals of the final months. Real food, prepared with real skill. The aroma of dashi. The sweet savory scent of properly seasoned rice. The delicate fragrance of miso. Smells that spoke of home, of normalcy. Of a Japan that had existed before the war tried to destroy everything. An elderly man in the crowd began to cry. A mother clutched her child. A young man who'd been shouting accusations fell silent, his nose lifted to the breeze carrying those impossible, precious smells. Keiko saw them. And she understood. She stopped her work, walked to the doorway, and spoke loudly enough for the crowd to hear. Tonight, she announced in Japanese, we cook for 200. Tomorrow we'll cook for more. This food, all of this food, it's for everyone. Soldiers, yes, but also civilians. Also you. Also your children. Also your elderly. The British brought enough for all of us. Not just for them, for all of us. Lies, someone shouted from the crowd. Why would they feed us? Before Keiko could answer, Lieutenant Winters appeared at her shoulder. He didn't understand the Japanese words, but he understood the tone, the tension. What's the problem? He asked quietly. Keiko hesitated, then explained, they don't understand why you would feed them. They think we're lying. Or that you're lying. Winters looked at the crowd, really looked at them. Saw the hollow eyes, the skeletal bodies, the children with distended bellies, the elderly who could barely stand. He'd seen it in Burma, in Singapore, in every corner of this brutal war. Occupation wasn't about feeding the enemy. Except, tell them, he said slowly, that we're not feeding the enemy. Because there is no enemy anymore. Just people who are hungry. And if we have food, and they're hungry, and we don't feed them. He paused, searching for the right words. Then what the hell did we fight for? When Keiko translated, the silence was absolute. Then a woman in the crowd, a woman holding a child, of maybe 3 years old, stepped forward. Is it true? She asked, her voice breaking. Is there really enough? For all of us? Yes, Keiko said firmly. For all of us. The meal that night was served under the stars in the courtyard of the old naval facility. Makeshift tables had been assembled from scrap wood. British soldiers sat beside Japanese civilians. Keiko and her women served dish after dish. Simple food, stretched to feed so many, but prepared with a care and skill that transformed basic ingredients into something approaching grace. Sergeant Morrison sat between a Japanese grandfather and a British corporal, teaching them both how to properly hold chopsticks, laughing at his own clumsiness even as the old man gently corrected his grip. Sachiko watched her 3 children eat real food for the first time in weeks, their faces glowing with something that looked almost like joy. Fumiko, who hadn't spoken in days, found her voice explaining to a curious Welsh soldier the significance of the way the rice had been prepared. And Keiko stood at the edge of the courtyard, watching, just watching, seeing enemies eating together, seeing the barriers between conqueror and conquered beginning to dissolve in the simple, profound act of sharing a meal. Lieutenant Winters approached her, holding a bowl. Mrs. Matsumoto, he said formally, I have to tell you something. Before the war I was studying to be a chef in London. Not military, civilian, proper chef training. French cuisine mostly. He looked down at his bowl. But this is different. I don't have the words. But it's not just food. It's something else. Something important. Keiko regarded him for a long moment. In Japan, she said carefully, we have a concept. Omotenashi. It means hospitality. But deeper. It means to serve from the heart, with no expectation of return. To see the person, not just the guest. To give dignity with the meal. She gestured to the courtyard. That is what we did tonight. We gave dignity. You gave dignity. To each other. I lost my brother. Winters said suddenly, the words tumbling out as if they'd been held back too long. In Burma. Japanese prison camp. He didn't make it. And when they sent me here, to Japan, to be part of the occupation, I thought... He stopped, struggling. I thought I would hate you all. Every single one of you. I thought that hate would feel good. Feel right. Like justice. And does it? Keiko asked gently. No, Winters admitted. It just feels empty. And watching you tonight, watching you cook for us even though we... He couldn't finish. Even though you bombed our cities? Keiko finished for him. Even though we killed your brother. Even though we've spent years trying to destroy each other? She nodded slowly. Yes. Even though all of that. Because what is the alternative? To keep hating? To let the war continue in our hearts even after it ends on the battlefield? That way lies only more death. Slower death maybe, but death still. She placed her hand on his arm, another shocking gesture of connection. Your brother died in a terrible place. My husband died in the firebombing of Tokyo. My restaurant, my life's work, burned to ash. We have both lost everything. But tonight? She looked out at the courtyard, at British soldiers and Japanese civilians sharing food, sharing laughter, sharing the first fragile moments of something that might become peace. Tonight, we choose to find something instead of losing more. We choose to build instead of destroy. That is the only way forward. Morrison approached, his face glowing with emotion. Ma'am, he said to Keiko, I need to tell you something. When my mother left Hiroshima, it was because her family disowned her. She married an Australian soldier from the First War, and they called her a traitor. She spent her whole life in exile, always carrying this grief that her own people had rejected her for choosing love over hate, for choosing connection over isolation. His voice cracked. But if she could see this, If she could see British soldiers and Japanese civilians eating together, cooking together, she would know that she was right. That it was all worth it. That the bridge she tried to build, it wasn't for nothing. Keiko bowed to him deeply. Your mother was brave. She built that bridge when no one wanted it built. She carried that grief so you could carry something else. Hope, maybe. Possibility. She straightened. Tell me about her cooking. Tell me what she taught you. And so Morrison did. As the evening wore on and the stars grew brighter over Yokosuka Harbor, the young half-Japanese Australian sergeant told stories about his mother's kitchen in Melbourne, about the dishes she'd made that carried the taste of a homeland she'd never see again, about the way she'd insisted on teaching him even though Australian boys weren't supposed to know about such things. And Keiko listened, adding her own stories, finding the common threads that connected a kitchen in pre-war Tokyo to a kitchen in wartime Australia to this makeshift kitchen in post-war Japan. Other soldiers drifted over. Other Japanese civilians. The conversation grew, sprawling across languages and experiences, becoming something larger than any individual story. It became a recognition that food was more than sustenance. It was memory. It was identity. It was the most fundamental way humans said to each other, "You are seen. You matter. You are worth nourishing." The next morning, Lieutenant Winters appeared at the kitchen with an unusual request. "Mrs. Matsumoto," he said, "Headquarters wants to expand the program. They want kitchens like this set up across the occupation zone. They want Japanese cooks working alongside British supply staff. They want—" He paused. "They want you to lead it. To train others. To help design a system that feeds everyone. Not just troops, but civilians. Properly. With dignity." Keiko looked at her women, all of whom had arrived early despite their exhaustion. All of whom had chosen to return despite the whispers and judgment from the town. She saw in their faces the same thing she felt in her own heart. Purpose. Not just survival, but purpose. "We'll do it," she said. "Under one condition." "What's that?" "We train British soldiers too, in Japanese cooking, in our methods, in our philosophy, so they can teach others, so it spreads, so that when they go home, they take with them not just the memory of occupation, but the memory of connection, of omotenashi, of feeding each other's humanity." Winters smiled, a genuine smile that transformed his face from military efficiency into human warmth. "I think that can be arranged. I think that's exactly what we need." Over the following weeks, the kitchen in Yokosuka became something unprecedented. British soldiers learned to make proper miso soup. Japanese women learned to adapt their techniques to feed hundreds efficiently. Children from both cultures played in the courtyard while meals were prepared. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, the hard lines between occupier and occupied began to blur into something more complex, more human. Not everyone approved. There were British commanders who saw fraternization as weakness. There were Japanese civilians who saw collaboration as treason. There were those on both sides who wanted to keep hating, who found comfort in the clear boundaries of us versus them. But in that kitchen, surrounded by the smell of cooking rice and the sound of tentative laughter, a different kind of war was being waged. A war against bitterness, against dehumanization, against the idea that peace was simply the absence of fighting rather than the active presence of connection. Keiko never got her restaurant back. The building was too damaged, and in truth, she had no desire to return to serving the wealthy elite. Instead, she spent the next 10 years teaching. Teaching Japanese cooks to feed their communities with dignity. Teaching British soldiers to see food as an act of peace. Teaching anyone who would listen that the most radical act of resistance against the destruction of war was to insist on nourishing each other. Sergeant Morrison stayed in Japan for 3 years before returning to Australia. He opened a restaurant in Melbourne that served Japanese food with the reverence his mother had taught him and Keiko had refined. He named it Hashi, Bridge. And above the door, he hung a photograph of that first night in Yokosuka, when British and Japanese sat together under the stars and chose to be human together. Lieutenant Winters went on to become a voice within the occupation administration for policies that emphasized reconstruction over punishment, dignity over subjugation. He never forgot that afternoon when 5 women with nothing had somehow given him everything, a way to process his grief, a path beyond his hatred, a future that wasn't defined by the past. And in Yokosuka, the story became legend. The story of the women who had nothing, no salt, no oil, no hope, until the day the enemy brought them ingredients and became something else. Something more complicated than enemy or ally. Something simply human. The true victory of that September afternoon wasn't won on a battlefield. It was won in the choice to see each other, to feed each other, to sit together and share not just food, but the radical, fragile beginning of peace. Not the peace of treaties and surrenders, but the peace of recognition. The peace of understanding that on both sides of the war, there were people who had suffered, people who had lost, people who were simply trying to survive and perhaps, in some small way, to live with meaning. When historians talk about the Allied occupation of Japan, they speak of policies and power structures, of military strategy and political maneuvering. But in the small corners of that massive, historical moment, there were kitchens, there were cooks, there were soldiers who chose mercy over vengeance, there were civilians who chose courage over bitterness, and there were meals, simple meals really, nothing fancy, that somehow contained the entire possibility of reconciliation. Keiko Matsumoto died in 1972 at the age of 90. At her funeral there were 3 British veterans in attendance, men who had served in the occupation and never forgotten the lesson of that kitchen. One of them, no longer young himself, placed a small box on her casket. Inside were kombu and bonito flakes, the ingredients for dashi, the foundation of everything. A reminder that sometimes the most revolutionary act isn't violence or resistance. Sometimes it's simply feeding each other, nourishing each other, choosing again and again to see the human on the other side of the divide. The war ended in August 1945. But peace began in September in a ruined kitchen with tears over salt and the recognition that enemies are just people we haven't fed yet. That's the lesson of Yokosuka. That's the power of a meal prepared with dignity, shared with humility, and eaten with the radical hope that yesterday's war doesn't have to be tomorrow's future. That's the taste of peace. Bitter and sweet. Simple and profound. Available to anyone with the courage to cook for each other, to serve each other, to sit down together and acknowledge that we're all just hungry humans looking for a way to nourish something deeper than our bodies. If this story moved you, hit that like button. Share it with someone who needs to remember that peace is possible, that bridges can be built, that enemies can become something more. Subscribe for more stories about the small moments that changed history. About the people who chose connection over division. About the radical power of simple human kindness in the face of impossible circumstances. And let me know in the comments. Have you ever experienced a meal that changed your relationship with someone? A moment when food became more than sustenance? I'd love to hear your stories. Because in the end, we're all sitting at the same table. The only question is whether we choose to pass the rice or keep our bowls to ourselves. And that choice, that simple, profound choice, that's what determines whether we live in a world at war or a world at peace.